Hello, my name's Andy Schmuckler. My shtick is a better human story. If you're who I think you are, you're like me in that ever since the election of 2024, life has been noticeably harder. It's like you walk around year to year, decade to decade, life always gives you a certain amount of burdens that you got to carry. But right now, uh, there's always this thing hanging back there that our country um, is being given a face and is conducting itself in a way which is just so ugly. Uh, there's a feeling of grief for what one at least could regard as being decent. And every once in a while, you could look at the United States and you could say, I'm proud to be an American. Well, I'm ashamed now. I mean, it's not the first time I haven't, felt with Vietnam, with W's war in Iraq. I was not happy being an American, but there have been lots of other times, and always there's been this basic solidity to the whole thing. And now we can see that we've broken through to a place where nothing nothing is entirely solid. Um, Rationality, responsible conduct of national security, lack of naked corruption of people using governmental power to enrich themselves, uh, the suppression of people's exercise of their constitutional rights, siding with the tyrant against the victim of his unprovoked aggression. Grief. A lot of things that one took for granted that was a floor beneath which the country would never actually stoop. There now is apparently no bottom, and that leads me to because to me problems are always something to be solved. Rather than just focus on the dismantling that's going on, and the things that in my lifetime at least will, will never be retrieved. For example, I'm about to turn 79. I don't think there's a chance that I could live long enough that our friends around the world would regard us with the kind of trust and respect um, that they did in large measure from World War II all the way through victory in the Cold War, and even into the post-Cold War period for quite a while. Uh, we went back to Trump. He had always gone out of his way to show that America was no longer the leader of the free world so nakedly. What kind of trust? I think it's sort of like what maybe like with how long it took the Germans to become after World War II, uh, more or less regular European uh, members of that society. They had so much to live down that was fresh in people's memories and that was so vivid. And how do you unsee the fact that the American people elected this guy after all that had been shown to be true about him? So we're never going to get that back, not in my lifetime. But I do like to envision what it might look like still within my lifetime if we really started to be the level of health that we used to be. I don't want to downplay the fact that anytime you look at Americans' power struggles in the political realm, and you're going to find ugly things going on. But generally within a certain range of, actually there is the rule of law. Actually, the will of the people does get a voice, if not as much a voice as it should. And all of that, what that we could take for granted, that is not there now. How do we get back to being able to see America as at least as good as it was? And I think that the important thing to know is that this is a really large job, because it isn't just the politics. We wouldn't have gotten to this place except for a whole range of cultural forces that were at work. The kind of cultural forces that I've been mostly talking about are on the conservative side of America. There's been the rise of a fascistic force that was extremely competent in propagandistic techniques that had as much time as it wanted to move the minds of conservatives into a place where the unthinkable was continually happening. So there was a transformation that occurred over the course of, I would say, well, since the rise of Limbaugh on the radio and Newt Gingrich in his Contract for America. The force became visible to me at that point, though I didn't recognize until 2004 just how profoundly vast and powerful this fascistic force was becoming. And it was able to, uncontested, shape the minds of most of the people in conservative America, so that by the time you get to the rise of Trump, you've got people in a very different place when they look out at the question of what do I want to have happen on the political stage. Reagan's supporters never would have gone for what Trump's supporters are going for. And so that suggests that there's how we heal America has got to include some effective working on the consciousness that enabled good and intelligent people back, say, in the time of Reagan and the first Bush, the Republican base, good and intelligent people to get to a place where they happily and fervently side with what is the opposite of good. And despite their intelligence, they apparently believe all kinds of things that aren't true. So that gives you an idea of sort of the profundity of the task of healing political America. Of course, there also has to be stuff happening in the political arena in which the forces of fascism no longer are in control. The winning of elections, and the winning of elections that would need to be more powerful in the force that it makes of winning of that election than Joe Biden was. I mean, it was great that Joe Biden won in 2020. it was that moment of like VJ Day of wanting to go out on the streets. And at last, we're back. And the Europeans asked Joe Biden as he resumed the role of leader of the free world, yeah, but for how long? And in my optimism, I thought, well, what do you mean? For how long? They apparently were worried that Trump would make it back. I didn't think that that was a real possibility. The idea that Trump, who had just inspired an insurrection and committed crimes right out there in public, could survive to run and win the presidency again. Well, the Europeans were already not confident about that after one term. But the fact that we've gone back to it, that's a whole different thing. When you got Canadians booing the Star-Spangled Banner at sports events because of the completely ugly, unnecessary, unstrategic, just an expression of malignancy that the President of the United States created an enemy of our best friend. And he did not lose appreciable Republican support for that. The people on the right have really gone over, Star Wars wise, over to the dark side. They are, one could make a list of things just like that they're willing to believe or that they're willing to support when things are so obviously not the way they're supposed to be. For example, I've challenged with my op-ed pieces out to conservatives. This isn't even Trump. You guys are treating as enemies. And then I made a whole list of things that were visible in the news of that time about how the Republicans were acting antagonistic toward Muslims, they were toward blacks, toward Democrats, and a whole list of things. And there was not a single group, and I challenge people, name a single group that you relate to with love and not hostility, or at least goodwill, that is not just you. And I couldn't think of any at that time, and I'm not sure I could think of any right now, unless it's an affection toward Putin, except that the Republican base, I don't think, shares that affection. The conservative side got put into a place where they were happy to have themselves expressed in the political arena with an attitude of sort of universal antagonism. And so one can challenge those people, as I did in this piece, if I recall, who regard themselves as Christians. And there's this huge overlap between here in the Shenandoah Valley, when we're talking about the Trump world and we're talking about the Christian world, the people for whom identifying as Christian is very central. More so, perhaps, than in the suburbs when liberals go to Christian churches. These Christians are giving them their support to a political force and or a leader that shows no love to our neighbors. And so we're dealing here with a kind of craziness in that there are two very important, passionate commitments alive in the conservative base, one toward sets of values that used to play a big role in their political lives, but now are pretty much excluded from their political lives, while in their politics, they support the opposite. No goodwill toward men, no peace on earth. They make a fight out of everything. One of the things that I think is sort of amazing about how can any decent, intelligent person, and these people are decent and intelligent, I know, because I live among them, be for a political party that shows no interest in playing what I think is obviously the role that any political actors are morally obliged to play, which is, given the distribution of power that the people have elected to make these kinds of decisions, what is the best thing that we can accomplish together that will help the people who sent us here and move America forward? I mean, I could not make a case about why anybody would have any other responsibility, given the circumstances. Doesn't mean it's always easy because of the disagreements that can be important. But what is it that we can achieve that serves, that achieves our common purposes? You know, like the United States and the Soviet Union were several times were up to toward the threshold of unleashing a civilization-ending nightmare on the planet, annihilating each other, mutual assured destruction, make the rubble bounce. It was pretty deep sense of conflict in that world, and yet even they, with life and death right there at the center of their relationship, even they could come together and achieve things like coming up with arms limitation treaties that have the effect of minimizing the chance that, for example, people would stumble accidentally into a war that could have been a nuclear war that could have been avoided. Like stable deterrence was one of the phrases of the time. But the Republican Party has never acted. I don't know how far back to go. Certainly not when Obama was president. And the way they went after Clinton was already a sign that something different was happening. It was not politics had become completely a struggle for power, according to the force that was rising to control the conservative party in America. To go back to how deep this stuff goes, the stuff that we need to be thinking about for the long-term healing of America. And I think that I'd be more popular if I had a simpler solution. But we've got people who are broken in a variety of ways, in ways that are completely expressed powerfully in our power politics. That broken between their values and what they support in their politics. That's crazy. Broken in their being detached from reality, in their believing a whole host of things that simply aren't true. And it should not be difficult to know are true. I think you got to call it craziness. And we're talking about a collective kind of craziness. Which I don't think the field has adequately conceptualized. I've looked into collective craziness issues, and I'm not sure how that the understanding is there. But we're dealing with sane people who, in their whose brokenness. I mean, it starts with a kind of brokenness in people. what happened is that this fascistic forces was good at exploiting brokenness that was already there. Um, you know, if you're already got some brokenness around the issue of race, for example, you're likely to respond better to the Haitians are eating your dogs and cats. The brokenness becomes part of so it goes all the way down. And it's got to do with all the flow. I mean, American racism, for example, we're only going to be able at best to take some of its power away. It's going to be there as far as the eye can see, and it can improve. But in order to improve, the other side of America also needs to make some fairly profound changes, which is, I would say, the thrust of what my work is in presenting a better human story, is to affect the way that liberal America, pro-democracy America, the thinking America, the grounded in reality America, the America that has a secular worldview such that it looks at the evidence and thinks systematically about it to see what's true. That America also needs to be transformed in some significant ways. In some ways, the whole issue of a secular worldview, it's an incomplete task in some important ways. It's not that old of a tradition. I mean, people like Newton were scientific, but their world was still had a huge place for God in it. And Kepler and people like that. The secular worldview that I think is the most powerful thing as a worldview in a liberal America and in the anti-Trump side is an unfinished task. It has so many superficialities to it, so many failures to see the patterns. It's a work in progress. And it's a work in progress that, because of the incompleteness of that task, was unable to see what was rising. It lacked an ability to see things whole. And it lacked a respect for the fact that there is such a thing as a moral dimension to the human world. The secular worldview sort of demeaned the idea of that being as real as objective things. So there was the lack of a means to engage moral and spiritual passions, to beat this thing down, to see it for what it was when it was rising in the early 90s, and to fight it effectively. Instead, the liberal side of the power struggle treated it as politics as usual, when actually on the other side, an unusual American force, unusual at least, it's never controlled a whole political party before. An unusual political force was rising in the Republican Party, and it was in the process of devouring it. To see that for what it is requires seeing something about the forces at work in the human world, which is what my Better Human Story is an attempt to do. So I think there's a lot of learning to do on our side, and there's a lot of spiritual work that needs to be done on the other side. The liberal side has always sort of been aware of which side is good and which side isn't good. I mean, some things get overdone. I think that the size of the trans issue in the liberal world is counterproductive and inappropriate, considering the enormous stakes in every level and every dimension, from Ukraine to climate change. It is which side wins this battle. There is a moral and spiritual dimension, which the religious understandings of the civilization we've arisen out of into modern civilization, the classical world of Greece and Rome and Jerusalem and Christendom and all the rest of that. It's all part of a story which is has to be seen at a vast scale to understand what the forces are at work in the human world. And what I believe is the best way to get there for liberal America to be connected with its, have its worldview connected with its moral and spiritual passions. Even now, the Democratic Party, for example, in fighting Trump, does not yet display what an ideal political party faced with this Trumpist onslaught would look like and sound like. It didn't during the Joe Biden's presidency. There's an attachment to in liberal America to we could see it in Obama and we could see it in Biden. There's an attachment to the idea of reaching across the aisle, dealing in goodwill, and not joining in out-and-out combat. There are built into us, I think I can show in an evolutionary way, that evolution has built into us a source of power and a source of guidance that's part of our experiential tendencies. It correlates a lot with what's life-serving, and that's why it's there. The evolutionary perspective that we've got that replaces the story in the Garden of Eden, but it also does furnish a way of understanding some of the same kinds of issues of good and evil that the story provided. That don't eat of the knowledge of the tree of good and evil. Well, according to this thing that I think can be shown, the battle between good and evil was an inevitable outcome in terms of systemic forces of a creature taking the step that our species took just 10,000 years ago onto the path of civilization, which means for the first time in the history of life, a species was extricating itself from the niche in which it had evolved biologically. It was developing a whole new way of life. No creature had ever done this. Every other creature had evolved simply biologically, but biological evolution had taken us to the point where we had the creative intelligence that chimpanzees still don't have, but the creative intelligence that would enable us to invent a new way of life. We take that step. It's the first time that's happened in the history of life. And I won't take it all the steps from there. That book back there, The Parable of the Tribes, The Problem of Power and Social Evolution, demonstrates, I believe, that the new situation, the unprecedented new situation that comes from breaking out of the biologically evolved order, the disorder that inevitably you plunge into when you take that step, will inevitably generate a destructive force. And to understand that destructive force leads to all kinds of other understandings of, oh, so this is what's happened to our species. The evolutionary perspective that came in that replaced that didn't deal with some of those issues. But it turns out that if you think things through, there are implications that can be drawn that are logically tight and that fit with the evidence, that inevitably the rise of civilization gives what's the phrase I'm looking for. It generates a destructive force. It can't be avoided. It is inevitably the result of not the nature of the creature that took that step. That, I think, is practically irrelevant, but the structure of the situation, which is an anarchy, inevitably, nothing to regulate how these things that are now having to interact outside of any order, no natural order, no ability to create and enforce any order by the creature. Instead, there's these interactions that are not like those in a biological system, because they have not been, so the interactions are not regulated in anything that's been shaped over the eons to serve the perpetuation of life. Anarchy gives way to the war of all against all. It is a destructive force, and you can see several ways of demonstrating just how destructive that particular force has been. The battle in America today is best understood as a battle between good and evil. And evil has a meaning that I think you can see has an evolutionary reality. And that is, evil is a coherent force that consistently works to make the human world worse. And the idea is, there are a couple of ways of showing that there is actually a coherent force. It arises with this war of all against all, and then it ramifies in shape-shifting ways. And there are two ways that one can demonstrate the coherence of the force. One is by tracing causes and effects. And you can see that there is a force that's moving a pattern of brokenness through the human world over time. Broken people, broken societies, break down into war, and causes and effects. And you can say about each broken thing, it is the fruit of other broken things, and it gives descendants, it has consequences into the future that are other forms of brokenness. So you can see the coherence of the force that way. But the other way you can see the coherence of the force is when you've got a particular actor, and the world doesn't present us with a whole lot of really pure cases. But today's Republican Party, the Republican Party that's been growing, emerging out of the first Bush presidency, the powers that took it over at that, started taking over at that point. That Republican Party just has become a coherent force that consistently works to make the human world more broken or worse. And what's remarkable about this Republican Party, and it's been increasingly true over the years, is that it really has become impossible in terms of consistency to make things worse, to point to, while they do make things worse in this way and on that way and on this issue, nonetheless, when it comes to this and when it comes to that, their contribution has been positive. It's been some years since I've been able to see any positivity, and if there's that sort of consistency of brokenness, that you know, if you know what the issue is in terms of broken and whole, like climate change, you know that the whole position has got to do with taking the responsible steps to protect the future of life on this planet, including our children and grandchildren. If that's obviously the whole side, the broken side is impeding our responding to protect the human future. Because by a party that is basically doing the bidding of the fossil fuel companies. And that brings us back to the whole issue of the Republican base. Isn't that kind of obvious? Isn't the Republican base have to see that their side is just continually on the side of away from the lion lies down with the lamb? Don't they see that their party is continually exacerbating hostilities and never looking to cooperate? I mean, when Jesus was born, the messages on the heaven were peace on earth and goodwill toward men. The Republicans make a fight out of everything. How can a Christian support that? And goodwill? The Democrats have not experienced any Republican goodwill for a long time. Goodwill and mutual respect, we'll steal a Supreme Court seat from you in 2016. And then the liberal side. And who knows, Barack Obama's combination of splendidness with complete weakness in dealing with the battle that was being waged against him. I don't know what it is that prevents them from fighting the fight. But that's another dimension. I think he and Biden both are dimensions of other transformations in liberal America that would help to heal America. America's politics are sick, in part because the Democrats, at some level of the spirit or emotion or something, have lacked the ability to put out into the world what needs to be put out into the world. So that when Barack Obama was president, the power of fascism in America increased. When Joe Biden was president, he did not succeed in diminishing the power of fascism. And in fact, it turned out on election day that the power of fascism had grown so great over the minds of the American people that virtually half of the American people could go to the polls after all that we had seen about Donald Trump. It really is an incredible kind of insanity, such profundity of ignorance, such hypnotic state, the whole list of things that are basically not the way a democracy should act. But the American people embody some kind of consciousness that got way off base. Half of America could do something that you'd have to be in some really bad place, unfortunate place, destructive to society place, to accept that and support that. We didn't get here just because of a few elections. The elections themselves were reverberations of things that were happening in deep cultural levels about the limitations of secular America in recognizing evil when it was right in front of their eyes. And certain things about in liberal culture which have to do with a repugnance to pressing the battle when it needs to be pressed, some kind of attitude toward conflict, some kind of values that say you can't fight all out, or maybe some kind of fear about some kind of weakness. There needs to be something Churchillian in the spirit of liberal America, and we're still waiting for that voice. So there are a lot of layers that are involved here. From Eisenhower and Stevenson's contests in the 1950s to Trump and Biden's struggles, or the struggles between the Democrats and Trump over the last decade. Something really strange was allowed to happen, and defects on both sides. What exactly were the defects on the Republican side that, I guess I won't go into that. I have a theory about how the Republican Party went bad, and it's got to do with how white supremacy and corporate greed, instead of canceling each other out, being allied with two different parties. That after the Democrats got their fingerprints all over civil rights, they lost the South, and white supremacy, white racism force and corporate greed force were under one tent and didn't cancel out each other, but took over the Republican Party. So one of the things that has to heal for America is a transformation of the Republican Party into something that's got a reasonable share of decency to it. I mean, the Republican Party of even Ronald Reagan, as conservative as he was, had fundamental decency about it. You wouldn't be embarrassed to have invited Ronald Reagan to your Thanksgiving table in terms of how he would behave. So we need a Republican Party that's completely different. And it's not just a matter of Trump. This Republican Party has been really destructive to democracy for 30 some years. The way they handled Clinton's presidency was not in the spirit of the Constitution. This guy's been hired by the people to do an important job. You don't go off on a hunt to see how can we impeach this guy. And we don't generate talk radio across the country talking about all the terrible things that Clinton did in Arkansas that aren't even true. the Democrats didn't help. But the decent Republicans didn't help their own cause much either. There are no particular acts of heroism, just a few. No, I should. The Liz Cheney and Adam Kinzinger and the people that stands for. But the Republicans have been willing to go along with something that's been getting uglier and uglier. I ran for Congress in 2012 because it already was so ugly, and because the Democrats were failing to call it out. There has been such a failure to perceive and such a failure to act. I was looking at some of my notes from 2005 about the Democrats needing to fight. And here we are 20 years later, and we've got Chuck Schumer thinking that we're not already there. It's not yet time to fight the fight, toe to toe. Now, if the Supreme Court, if he won't obey Supreme Court injunctions, well, then we would have a constitution. No, we've got a constitutional crisis right now. When you've got a president who is showing wanton disregard for the law, I mean, it's not just, we got to get to the Supreme Court for them to tell us what the law is. We see he has no regard for the law in one way after another. I mean, how many cases are there of pretty blatant illegality? So what is it in democratic America that gets in the way? It's not just the failure to see, have the concept of evil being a reality. There's also something about fighting. There's something that's stronger about a Churchill who conveys to his people a real fighting spirit because of what he says and how he says it. Now, he was a particular oratorical genius who was playing a role perfectly suited to his extraordinary gifts, the extraordinary moment he rose to, and he almost, without him, we would have lived in a very different world, according to most people's calculation of what would have happened had Churchill not been right there at that time, inspiring his people to stand their ground rather than make peace with the Nazis. I don't know what form that might take. But there is a problem in liberal America that there's an increasing sense right now that there's a need to fill the field with the banner of real oratorical power, of people who are speaking in a voice and to the American people in a way that's best calculated to win this battle, which essentially is a battle against a coherent force that consistently works to make things worse. And if that's a good definition of evil, and I think it is, that means it's a battle against evil. And that means that the right way to understand our present battle is between good and evil. And the more fully we understand our place in the drama, the more fully we are connected with the reality of a moral and spiritual dimension, which the process of evolution has created in our experiential realm because it was life-serving. And so we need to tune in on it to recognize its tendency to get some important things right. We are born with certain things. The culture may flesh them out in different ways, and those differences may be important. But we are not just random stuff. We are human beings with an inborn sense of value and with an inborn capacity, at least widespread capacity, for experiences of a special sort that mean that the spiritual dimension exists within the human world. That is where we come from, a deeper place. And the sooner we can get to that deep place where we've got, when we listen to those voices on center stage, we get inspired in the same way that those blockbuster films I keep bringing up, because they show our capacity to throw our passions behind the good in its battle against the evil. Star Wars is an example. The Lord of the Rings trilogy is an example. And Avatar is an example. These are the places that they capture the essence of the real drama that we're engaged in the battle between democracy and fascism. Those two really do map very well between, do the tendencies of this one tend to make things more broken or more whole? And the tendencies of this side are the same. It's pretty clear that democracy is substantially aligned with the things that make the world better. And fascism, with its lies, with its conflicts, with its victimization of the vulnerable, with its madness for power and wealth, all those things clearly are forces that make things more broken. We are engaged in a great battle between good and evil. It can be understood as our particular manifestation at this moment, in this place in history, of a battle that's been going on ever since our species stepped across that decisive line between being within the natural order and then being in this new and therefore disordered system. Understanding the nature of the drama and connecting with what's really to be recognized as what's good and fought against as what's evil, and some things being experienced as sacred, because sacred can only have any meaning if something that experiences as sacred. And people sometimes do experience some things as sacred. And all of that is a powerful thing, and it has evolutionary standing. And so what was given up in becoming a secular worldview, one might have thought, well, yeah, well, it makes a lot more sense given the age of the planet at 4.5 billion years than this story in the Bible. But, the idea of there being anything sacred, well, we got no underpinning to respect the reality of something being sacred or being good. But that's just that unfinished task. And so I hope you'll go to betterhumanstory.org and you'll see my efforts over a considerable period of time to weave all these things together into an integrated situation, where the same perspective that shows where this force of evil came from, that has manifested itself in America now in this extraordinary way, that came from the same thing that meant that the ugliness we see in human history is not human nature writ large. Think of that as, if you could prove that, what a gift that would be, to recognize that all this ugliness doesn't reflect on us the way we have been taught to do, and the way the secular worldview gives us no other way of seeing it. It was inevitable that the spirit of the gangster, which is connected with fascism, would have a disproportionate say in how the human world would develop. I mean, look at the world stage right now. Our battle between good and evil is part of that larger thing that we can see. The fascist dictator in Moscow invading Ukraine, the fascist regime in Israel and their way of responding against the terrible things Hamas inflicted against them, but doing it in a way which basically, like fascists in general, always making the decision that leads to making things more broken. Here in America, we've got our version of it. In Turkey, there's another version of it. It is a good alignment, and it's all traceable to this infinitely complex web of causes and effects that moves through history. All the ways that we would account, for example, for how did it come to be that so many white people in America would have feelings about race that are of this nature. Well, there is a whole history, and all of that unfolds. And how you heal history, that is going to be part of the task. This all happened because of a deep sickness in our civilization, where the right had certain kinds of brokenness and a force that arose from it and exploited the brokenness in the rest of the force and took it over and made the people crazy, made them aligned with evil. Whereas on the left, there are people sleepwalking through some of the most threatening developments in American history and not waking up until maybe it was too late, just like Winston Churchill's becoming prime minister. It was almost too late. I hope that this will prove to be like that. The most immediate task to healing American brokenness is to get out of America messages so crafted and so distributed and so delivered as to maximize the extent of pulling the American people away from this force that they can only support by being really their own worst selves. And so it is not untoward to try to bring them back to the better angels of their nature. Healing them would be doing the nation, the world, and them a real favor. I will say, as a non-Christian, that a Christian who's got some of that spirit that one's read about being out there in Trump land, of Christians that are so far out that they're calling Jesus too weak. I mean, they're rejecting Jesus. Some ministers have reported that they get that in their congregations. That is such a far distance from the Christianity which, as an observer, I would say is good for people's hearts and souls. I know Christians whose Christianity is connected with their living in some beautiful ways. And I think it would be a big favor to those Christians out there who are aligning with Trump if one could bring them back to the better angels of their nature, where they would respond to Trump the way the New Testament would respond to Trump, Jesus and those teachings. There's really not much question about it. And my sense is the anger, the hatred, the fear that has been cultivated in conservative America is no fun for them. So I don't know how people can be brought back from this mistake of mistaking the evil for the good. But that should be the quest, to find the way to bring them back. Both because to the extent to which their decency can be applied to the political realm again. We reach that tipping point where it's like a teeter-totter, bring them back from the wrong side of the fulcrum and back to the right side so that we are heavy enough to rule the day. I think it should be some kind of 100 flowers bloom kind of thing, but with an eye to seeing if we can make connections and coordinations to present to the American people in many ways and in as much as possible an impactful overall way. The picture of our reality and our choices between good and evil that bring people back to the side of, trust the power, Luke, to the right side of the force. That's, as I see it, the immediate task. And the one of the places is the Democratic Party to find its best voices, to find the Churchills and the William Jennings Bryants and the FDRs and all those people to step up and speak from their moral and spiritual power in the ways that those great people did. Martin Luther King, I should not forget him. JFK's inaugural address, if you want to put that in. But this is going up against fascism. And the American people, I still believe, if the majority experienced fully and saw clearly everything that's at stake in this battle, I think the number of people who would go with fascism is a minority, not nearly a 50-50 thing. Maybe I'm wrong, but that's my belief. And that's why I believe that we need those voices out there summoning that majority together. I'm Andy Schmuckler. My efforts to create an integrated picture you'll find on abetterhumanstory.org. Thank you. Bye-bye.